No.
That's good. So we'll start the meeting. We have a quorum, and would you do the Kirikea, please? Sure. Dave.
Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te atakua, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, mauri ora.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Dave. Now, apologies, please.
So we have apologies from Mayor Brown, from Claire, and from Ian McKenzie.
Okay, I'll move those apologies accepted. Second to Chris, all in favour? Aye, carried, thank you. We've got welcome. So there's no extraordinary business that I know of, David? No, nothing coming up, but anyone in the public can certainly contribute if you wish. Register of interest in front of your board packs. So confirmation of minutes, so the minutes have been circulated, and before I move them as a true record, is there any adjustments anyone wants to make or anything? So I'll move the minutes for the last meeting as a true and accurate record. Seconded, please. Thank you, Richard. All those in favour? Aye, carried. Any matters arising? That's not going to come up in the meeting. No, that's good. Correspondence, David. Any correspondence?
No correspondence.
Public contributions. Well, they'll come up if they come up, yeah. Yep. All right, so our first thing on the agenda is Mid-Canterbury Catchment Collective Update with Ange. Questioning, so Ange, the floor is yours, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be here to present this overview and this update of Mid-Canterbury Catchment Collective. And I'd first of all like to acknowledge, I guess, the knowledge I've gained by being on the Ashburton Water Zone Committee since 2017 now. So I probably wouldn't be confident or competent as a coordinator of this group if I hadn't sat around this table and been part of some many and varied conversations. So acknowledging both of those before we start. If we jump back, when we started Mid-Canterbury Catchment Collective in late 2021, this was the vision that our inaugural committee pulled together. Now that we're 3 years on, we have a much better appreciation for what is required, especially that intergenerational stewardship, and just how powerful and engaged and informed community is. When we talk about engaged, there's the community-facing element of when we do engagement, and that's through our catchment groups and other entities. But engagement also includes, it's not a single focus, it includes rural professionals, local businesses and organisations. It includes MPI, now via the MPI on-farm support team, Environment Canterbury, and I'd like to acknowledge the operations review that happened recently and the teams that they've put in place and the meetings that we've been able to host that are building a much better relationship with organisations like ECAN. It's important that we understand the different perspectives, and to that end, that engagement and education swings both ways. Also Ashburton District Council, so some ongoing conversations with them. Also we've presented to Rotary, Zonta and scientists, so that slide is a daily occurrence with MCCC. If we go back to funding, start by acknowledging the enormous amount of in-kind hours that went into establishing MCCC as an entity. So that's before the funding came, lots of heavy lifting required to get an organisation like that off the ground. That included the 3 catchment groups who were forming in those early days, being the Foothills, the Hekio-Hines Hill Country and the Hekio-Hines Lowlands. In 2023, the Ashburton Water Zone Committee recognised the value in catchment groups, implementing change on the ground, and they seed funded the coordination of MCCC to the tune of $30,000, and that came through the Zone Committee Catchment Action Plan funding. In September of that year, we put forward an application to the MPI Essential Freshwater Fund. The criteria is, as you can read it there, With less than 10 months before this project concludes, I'd like to take you through some of the outcomes of this in-kind zone committee and MPI resourcing. So that's what the 950,000 across 3 years, that's what we were tasked to do. So different catchment groups have different funding pools and different criteria. But in particular, one of our main ones has been around improving the long-term capability and capacity in the freshwater management space, acknowledging within McKennabury we have an abundance of capability, wearing many various hats, but capacities, it's not an infinite resource, so we're wanting to make sure that we use that wisely. The structure we pulled together from the outset looked at, if we start with freshwater, stakeholder engagement and strategic partnerships, so it made sense that we worked really collaboratively with key groups and organisations in McKennabury. Wellbeing was the people in the community component of what makes up a catchment. The business planning is we need to be able to add value and not just be valid because we've got funding. We need to exist beyond this funding. So the business planning sits in that column. Catchment groups are the obvious component, and that incorporates biodiversity and soil and nutrient management also. This digs down a little bit further into the strategic goals that we put in place, and each person on our committee championed one or more of the elements. Soil health risk assessment and mitigation management will be part of our final criteria. So as we've done water monitoring, it's important now that we understand. So if you're Chris's group and you've been monitoring water and, I don't know, for example, there's a sediment problem or an erosion problem, then the mitigation management strategy becomes part of the catchment action plan. Lots of different elements to it, some bespoke to different catchments and some are quite generic across all 10 of our catchment groups. Our focus has been on empowering catchment communities by bringing ideas, action and science together to improve our environmental footprint, support catchment group initiatives and champion community wellbeing. At a glance, this is what it has looked like. So 3 groups initially, now 10. 2 are urban and rural groups, which is Carter's Creek and Mount Harding, which flows through Methven. That urban-rural makeup brings about opportunities and challenges. In particular, those 2 groups have got quite a bit of interface with Environment Canterbury and Ashburton District Council. This takes a lot of time, a lot of energy and a lot of capability to be able to navigate organisations. So it's not just the community coming up with a catchment action plan, you have to do it in conjunction with others. The rest of that's a breakdown of the things that we've been doing, but I'll go into more of that as we step through the different catchment groups. These have been our building blocks to help tell our story, and granted some of what's happening already, for example, in the lowlands, benefited from the work undertaken by the Hinds Drains Working Party, but the scale of engagement we're seeing now greatly enhances it as a district. So we have 10 catchment groups, Green Street being the newest one to come on board. They're not included in that map yet, but it's pretty obvious where they would go when we get our GIS mapping up to date. The areas that are not coloured are predominantly one of 3 of our major irrigation schemes. So the groups that have formed are looking for efficiencies at a catchment scale when they're trying to tackle perhaps the challenges and opportunities relevant to their catchment. We'll start with the Hekio Hinds Hill Country Catchment Group, and that's just a map overview of what they've got in their area in terms of waterways, etc. Their key focus has been water monitoring, biocontrol, riparian planting, and they have some amazing examples of intergenerational environmental stewardship. They're focusing on the past, the present and the future. They today, or this morning, hosted a What's Living in Your Awa. It's a Y Connection Mountains to Sea workshop. So they bring the freshwater ecologist experts down from Christchurch, and they're looking in, I think, 3 different sites. So it'll be interesting to see the outcomes of that day. And also that group is hosting on the 11th of December. They've got integrating biodiversity into intensive farm systems with Professor David Norton. So that'll get circulated later as well, but quite an active group with plenty happening. As you will recall, early this year, they received some funding from the Ashburton Water Zone Committee for phase 2 of their project. Nicole's provided a mid-progress report on that. There's a bit of detail in there, but it's an overview of what she presented initially and then what phase 2, what they've achieved to date. And of course, as part of their reporting requirements, Nicole will come in and give a more comprehensive update of what it is that they're achieving, and then what that, water monitoring looks like beyond the current funding program that they've had support from. The Foothills Catchment Group, not a traditional catchment, if you like, it runs across the foothills, so catchments traditionally come down, but within that catchment group there's sub-catchments that are made up and make sense. Obviously some landowners up that way too have properties in different parts of the catchment, so they're working together on what they're focusing on. They've done a monthly water monitoring program. Some of it's done with a hydrometrics nitrate sensor and with quarterly samples sent to Hill Labs. So there's calibration, there's making sure that it's not just the nitrate sensor that we're doing it alone, that it matches up with what Hills are saying. On the left, you'll see Kimberley Dines and Shirley Hayward actually from Environment Canterbury. So they did some training with this group early on just to build the capability. Analysis of the data has been carried out by Dr. Brett Painter. So did 12 months, looked at where they were monitoring and were the data sets or was the information that they were gathering appropriate, made a few tweaks, and then in those guys they're tying in with some of the monitoring that Environment Canterbury is doing. So if we're doing it at the same time and regularly and being transparent with it, we get a better understanding of it's not your data or our data or their data. All the data is important if we're going to make informed decisions. The Hekio Hines Lowlands Catchment Group, if most of you will be familiar with that, that was part of the Hines Drains Working Party and quite an intensive area that needed a focus, so that'll be something the Zone Committee's been familiar with for a very long time. We're focusing on the overall health of the waterways, including the Hekio Hines River, and the key drains which are known to carry water through the dry periods. Underscore the dry periods, that's becoming more of a focus as, I guess, the stockwater race thing's being revisited, as irrigation methods have changed, and we know that historically some of our lowlands drains have gone dry for many different factors. We're mindful that we invest our time, when I say we, I'm part of the Lowlands Catchment Group, that we invest our time and resources in the waterways that can sustain aquatic life. There you'll see the Windermere Drain, Mark Webb, who's since retired from Fish and Game, but that was a regular monitoring electric fishing that they carried out to good results. On the top right, there's the opening of the Wairuna runoff. So that's a denitrifying case study that we're doing down in the lowlands and one of the drains that feeds into the lower reaches of the Hines. And at the bottom right is a science contraption, I'll call it. There'll be a better name for it, but it's eClean. So it's some other sort of cutting edge technology that we're trialling in terms of looking at how we get some of the nitrates out of our drains. Lowlands also received some Zone Committee funding, $10,000 quite early on, and that was for the purchase of a nitrate real-time sensor. Lagmore Westerfield Catchment Group, so they're on the south side of the south branch of the Ashburton. They've got Riverbridge Conservation Park, which is a QE2 covenant in their area, so they've learnt a lot about the biodiversity and the work that Russell Langdon's been doing for 24 years now, wetland protection. So he's got mudfish, freshwater crays. In fact, there's some amazing images that have come out of there in recent times. I think Riverbridge is another recipient of the Zone Committee funding, and Russell and his grandson are putting that to good use. Recently, Lagmore Westerfield hosted a catch crop validation trial also. So there's images from that day, but it was in conjunction with MHV Water and Hekio Hines Water Enhancement Trust. It was co-funded. Plant and Food Research ran the trial in conjunction with, I think they've done 42 other trials across the country. So we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel on the science of catch cropping. We were simply looking at validating it under a dairy system with a farmer that's considered extremely innovative, uses technology, and it's one of our more savvy operators in terms of reducing his environmental footprint. So we took the catch crop trial to that place to see how we can improve his farm system. So that was thanks to Ben and Shannon Johnson, who hosted that day. It provided an opportunity to talk about soil health, risk assessment and mitigation management specific to improving water quality. So catch cropping, so what? Why would we bother? We got a chance to talk about water quality in the Langmore-Westerfield catchment, the monitoring that they're doing, and also talk about the receiving catchments below and beside. So the cumulative effect of the water in the aquifers and the springs as they travel down through the plains. Abby Horrocks from FAR was on site too, so she's doing some visual soil assessment. So it was a pretty practical, hands-on sort of a day. We got a good turnout. We're looking forward to more opportunities like this, and we're doing that in conjunction with the Hekio Hines Science Collaboration. So MCCC is a small part of a bigger picture of the investment that's happening in that district or in that catchment. Quite committed, working with science, and that's got a long-term focus also. Carters Creek Catchment Group, this is one of our urban rural, obviously feeds into Lake Hood. Significant engagement with Environment Canterbury and ADC required here, and it has happened to date. They're doing ongoing water monitoring. Initially they collaborated with the Lake Hood Task Force Group. I understand there's been a change down there, so I perhaps need to update that information. Flooding and drainage issues, both in Timwilden and the lower reaches, have been a significant challenge for people living alongside Carters Creek. They received about $15,000 from the Ashburton Water Zone Committee to look more closely at that science and design and develop a concept plan for ways of improving it. So we'll be getting an update from Carters Creek in due course. Ashburton Forks, Chris Allen's the chair of that group. It is the premier group, apparently. I was waiting for that. They're doing monthly water monitoring, and they're doing there's landowners there doing wetland enhancement, and I was lucky enough to get a tour of that recently. So some monitoring of water above wetlands and below, and understanding, again, what mitigations farmers can put in place. They have a significant focus on predator control. Makes sense where they sit between the two branches of the Ashburton. Earlier this year they received funding for auto traps from the Ashburton Water Zone Committee. That's an example photo, but 8,480 means that they've got 15 auto traps. Each group member will have access to the traps. They will get appropriate training, and it'll be made available so that everybody has confidence in what they're doing. There's numbers of what those traps can achieve, and Chris, feel free to step in here now. And
We've had one in place for 70 days, and it's got 20 possums and 2 rats, and they're big chunky rats, but just about every week there's another 2. Last week was an exceptionally good week. It was a really bad night for the possums, because I check it each day because I'm really interested in it, and there was 3 possums just lying at the bottom of it. So, great. Love them.
Getting us towards that predator-free. Mount Harding Catchment Group, one of our newer ones to form. Like I said, they're urban rural, so Mount Harding runs through, I think they've got Time Stream running through Methven, starts in the foothills. It's augmented quite significantly by Stockwater Race, so their overall focus on their challenges really start with understanding what Stockwater decisions will be made before they proceed too much further. Like Carters Creek, they have flooding and drainage issues, so there's a fair bit of transit and cross-agency discussions required within that group. Janine Holland, their facilitator, is well placed to host those discussions, but none of them are easygoing, and it all takes time. Whitcomb Landcare Group, I won't go into too much detail, mainly because they presented to the Zone Committee recently. We had Paul Ensor and the MCCC facilitator, Megan Fitzgerald, come along. They gave a comprehensive overview of this catchment and their aspirations. They've been going for over 30 years as a land care group. They have a big ownership of the health of this catchment and a strong desire to see that continue going forward. So we can help facilitate some of those discussions. In particular, I think if we look at things like the Rakaia River Enhancement Society funding, that we are a representative on that group, the Zone Committee is. So how can we support the communities with some of their aspirations and make sure that they tie in with the visions of LINZ and DOC and ECAN? So we've got a work to do there. Ashburton Lakes Catchment Group, again, they've presented reasonably recently to us. Because of the focus in this group and the level of detail that's required in a sensitive lakes area, recently MPI supported Ashburton Lakes separately with some separate funding. So they got some catchment extension services funding, which has given them a separate piece of work and a separate project across 5 years. So lots happening up there, and looking forward to getting an update from them. I think they've got a big meeting up there on Thursday with the Ashburton Lakes Working Group, so it'll be worthwhile waiting to see the outcomes of that. Our most recent group, and group number 10, is Green Street Catchment Group. Because they're only new to form, we don't have their catchment action plan underway. Well, it is underway, but we don't have an update to give you on that, except to say recently we did a stream health assessment monitoring training day there. That's on Ian Hood's property on Green Street Creek. Ian's chairing the group, but as they form, we'll get more information and we'll update you in due course. We did NIWA pulled together a stream health monitoring assessment kit quite some time ago. We did a training day Monday week ago, and we had 3 different sites. So we started on the right is in the Staveley foothills, in the track that leads you up to Sharpland Falls. So that was the start of it, and we did quite comprehensive training there. Our next stop was with Chris Allen. This is the confluence, correct me if I'm wrong, of Boyers and Taylor's streams. Yep. So we got to put our training into practice there and have a look at the health of those waterways, which was all very impressive. The idea is to do more of the training days. So we do our monitoring of our waterways through chemistry, and that's your nitrogen sensor, that's E. coli, that's phosphorus. So there's a range of things we do there, but we also look at the health of the waterways from an invertebrate perspective. And the recent introduction of eDNA ensures that we can not just look at one component of the waterway, we're looking at it more holistically. So if mitigations are required, we understand what are the challenges for that waterway and what mitigations can we put in place. We did an engagement day. It was an interactive educational field trip with Year 11 Ag students from Ashburton College. So they went to Phil and Jost Everest and looked at farm systems. We went to Ian and Di Mackenzie's, looked at the mudfish habitat and what was required to keep this endangered species thriving on that property. And then we went to the Windermere Drain. So we did SMAC training there also and looked at biodiversity enhancement, so riparian planting. I'd have to say a very engaged group of young students with some awesome questions. So we'd look to do that more going forward. Part of our building capability and capacity is that we offer training opportunities. So that's training in leadership, training in governance. So we need to know where our future leaders are coming from. So as Bill and Phil and others, look to succession, some of the knowledge and some of all the heavy lifting they've done, look to succession it over to the next generation. We need to ensure that they feel confident when they step into often pretty big shoes. So Ignite Leadership is a 2-day course. It's hosted here in Ashburton and many other places, but it's nice that it comes to town so we don't have so much downtime travelling. Harry Miller and Anna Munro did it recently, and that they made up, we've had 12 participants in that course now. Harry's a farming boy himself, but his quote there, this is the first leadership program he's attended that is tailored to the rural sector and able to address the complexities of leading in this environment. So each and every person, without exceptions, come back from this training course feeling really quite empowered to step into leadership roles, at whatever that looks like. Recently, I had the opportunity to attend a 3-day Engage course at Lincoln University, run by the rural leaders. So we're out at a dairy farm in Bar Hill? No, I don't know. North of the Rakaia. I've lost track of where I was. Before that, we went to a Bar Hill mixed arable site. So we looked at farm systems from a financial perspective, from a biological perspective. In that group there, I think there's about 3 representatives from ECAN, which was great to see. There were regulators from as far north as the Waikato. There were scientists from Northland. So they're looking at food and fibre systems 101 and the basics of, why when we go out and talk to farmers about different things, so they get a little bit frustrated that perhaps the people that are coming to talk to them aren't as skilled up as they could be. So day one, the mindset was we're just here to tell farmers what they need to do. They just need to listen to us and we'll sort out all the problems. End of day 3 was a complete and utter shift in mindset. The people in the room were, how can we support the farmers? Because the sheer volume of stuff that's coming at them means that it doesn't matter how clever you are or how much time you've got on your hands, it makes it difficult to navigate. So when we brought quite a bit of context in the room with the various speakers who talked to us across the 3 days, there was a much greater appreciation for what it is that farmers are already doing and catchment groups, and also, I guess, the time frame that it's going to take to ensure that we've got a sustainable way forward for everyone. So it was a privilege to be there, but it also gave me faith that that change in mindset that I saw happen across those 3 days is achievable, which is what keeps me going back to the table and having discussions with ECAN and the likes. Yesterday we hosted a business planning strategy day. Our funding runs out 1 October, so what are the things that we absolutely have to focus on going forward? This has been all enormous seed funding. It's set us up to succeed. We've got a period of time left with some money to invest, but we have to make sure that we invest it wisely so that we can continue to, come along and deliver updates like this. That brings me to the end of our Empowering Catchment Communities update. Happy to take any questions.
Very, very impressive. Any questions for Richard?
Yep, thanks, Angela. You talked about the funding running out, the seed funding. When the catchment groups get going, do you think they can be not self-funding, but self-fulfilling, and they get enough momentum that they can carry on without needing a lot of capital put in?
Yeah, so unfortunately I was unwell and couldn't attend the event yesterday. There's 2 schools of thought. There's the what's it going to take to keep the lights on at MCCC? So that coordination piece, there's acknowledgement that when we're coordinated and cohesive, it's that's where we get the efficiencies. So there's that bit. And then there's the catchment groups themselves and what's it going to take to keep them going. So there's an element of self-funding in that. But I guess until we come together and look at really what have we achieved over 3 years with that funding, and then what do we need to continue to achieve going forward, nobody's singly got the answer, and there's no one size fits all answer. What that discussion looks like in Southland at the moment, because again they're faced with those funding challenges, versus Northland, is part of what's open to discussion and open to debate.
Do you think is there a physical cliff coming where it just stops and that's the end of it, funding wise, or is there ongoing negotiations with you know, your funders going forward? You know, is it just no, there's no more funding, or is there option? You know, do you think that some will happen?
There is ongoing discussions happening. So, for example, across Canterbury, I think 10 catchment groups from the Hakateramea through to the Hiranui got together and put in a submission into the long-term plan with ECAN. So we got a no, but would like to keep talking to you about it. Obviously, the zone committee is under review, so, you know, I guess we see ourselves as the implementation on the ground. So when we do our zippers and everything else, the implementation, somebody's got to go out and do the doing. And if we can do that at a catchment scale, it makes more sense. So within central government, absolutely there's awareness. Within beef and lamb and industry, there's an awareness of what's been gained over this increasing uptake of catchments, of empowering communities. Where it all lands, Richard, I'm not too sure. For example, prior to this, the amount of in-kind that had to go into pulling it together wasn't sustainable. My concern is that people will just think, oh, we'll leave it to the communities and they'll sort it out. If it's not appropriately resourced, you're putting the burden of responsibility on just a small group for the benefit generally. If you look at 160 years of modification, that's got us where we're at. So what we're trying to do now is navigate our way forward, but it needs adequate resourcing so you haven't got one or two people having to do all the heavy lifting.
Sydney? It's an online question from Sydney. You there, Sydney?
Well, I was trying, couldn't do the microphone. Wow, that's amazing stuff happening there, Angela. So cool to hear. I actually got two questions for you. One is about the data analysis responsibility. So you're saying that Brett is doing the analysis for the Heckel Hines Lowland Catchment Group. And so what about the others? And so who are doing the analysis for the other catchment group? If maybe you have appointed individuals for each group doing that analysis, then how are you going to see the consistency between those analyses? And then the second question is about the results of those monitoring programs, and does that match up with the effort that the groups are putting into? Because it seems like they're putting a lot of effort into the work.
Okay, so if I just go to the first question. So the analysis, and Chris might like to speak to this, they had, I think it was through the access to experts. You had a scientist come in and work with your group on analysis of what you've been doing. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, what we did is we've been doing water testing, but we don't know what we don't know and how to ask the right questions. But first of all, when we're doing the testing, we thought we'd better make sure that we're doing it in a robust form. So someone went through and checked out the way we're actually collecting the water, what we're doing and how it's getting analysed through the nitrate meter. But we also need to know that over years, we need to collect robust data and not analyse it on the day to day, because you've got to put that context into it. Was it a dry season? Was it a wet season? What's going on? So that we can actually get trend analysis later on. But at the moment, it's making sure that we've got the data in the right places. We also used Brett. He came along and he talked about some of the data that we did actually have, which was some of the long-term ECAN data, and it was actually all over the place. You couldn't say that it was high nitrates up by the hills and it was getting lower further down. It was a scattergram that was high and down the bottom, and there was some high up the top, but you went across our catchment and then you had a completely different story. So we just got to make sure that we're getting the data that's robust, and then we can interpret it when we've got a good data set. Does that help the answer?
Yeah, you guys had Greg Burrell come out too, didn't you, a freshwater ecologist, and help you look at your catchment through his eyes. So Sydney, I mean, to the point of your question, we have standard operating procedures. We've worked through some analysis paperwork and content that we're pulling together. We're working under the Hekio Hines Science Collaboration. So we're not first group to start gathering data and trying to get an understanding of it. So we're sharing the knowledge with others that have been doing it for a lot longer. So Brett in the Hekio Hines, obviously his time and knowledge is covered within his role. But if he works, say, with the Ashburton Forks group, we cover his time on a cost recovery basis. So the consistency we're getting is with someone like Brett, and then the work that he does at some stage will get peer reviewed. So leaning on the knowledge of the experts in that space, does that answer your question adequately?
Yes, I was just interested to see if Brett was doing the analysis for all the catchment groups, or if each catchment group is doing that individually.
Mostly him to this stage, but bearing in mind some of the groups have been going for 3 years, some of them have only been doing it for 9 or 10 months, so they're at various different stages.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, and so where's all this being collated? Is it all being kept within each group, or where does the data go once you?
Yeah, so we have what's called SharePoint, where if we standardise how we collect it, how we store it, how we analyse it, the idea is it will go into SharePoint, which is quite a big piece of work. That technology side of things needs expertise, so we've funded that as well to get that in place. We're working through some privacy and confidentiality. So when we're collecting, or when the catchment groups are collecting data, we want to make sure that they feel confident collecting it and sharing it. And then ultimately, what's the end goal with collecting all this data? Are we just collecting it to put it in the bottom drawer for one day we might need it, or do we want to use it to go out and tell a story about the health of our catchment? So some of those things, it's not really until we've started collecting it that the conversation's now matured to that point. So my understanding is that yesterday, the funding that we've got going forward is really going to start exploring a lot more of that in a lot more depth.
Well, I think that'll be a good thing, because science is so important, and when you get some groups coming out saying X, and that might not be correct, and if we've got data that's genuine and well researched, and we can say, well, actually your X is wrong, that's Y, and we can prove it, because that'll be good.
So we still don't know at this stage, because most of the data has not been looked into it. But my second question was about, was there a mismatch between the efforts that the catchment groups are putting into and the actual results?
I don't think so, Sydney. If we go back through if we go back to some of those first points, engaging, educating and empowering, the catchment groups, anecdotally, we all talk about the way we used to remember things, the Hines River used to do that. I mean, there's so many different takes. I mean, Chris was talking about it the other day with the Ashburton River, so you can read something the Ashburton River used to. Until we really start gathering the data and doing it in a meaningful way, so data sets need to be big and long and enduring, we're not really working with, we're giving our best guess. So the difference in the catchment groups, the confidence that they've got, now that they've, say look at the Foothills group with 3 years of data, they have a much better understanding of what's happening in their catchment. Prior to that, they didn't really know, or they'd look to ECAN for information, and there's very limited water monitoring happening in those areas. So the efforts that gone into first gathering the information that'll inform, so it's problem definition, I suppose. Has the problem been defined, or is there a problem? And you can only understand that by putting in that initial inquiry.
Just to add to that, Ange, in our group we're doing monthly water testing. There's about 35 or 40 sites, I think, that bottles that come in, which Paul Will has to go and we're doing it today. So every month we're building up a picture, but we've got no idea really as to where the problem is. Is there a problem?
Right-leaning reporter, and it's going to write a story saying it costs weight.
So it's at the moment we're getting the data, and it's a lot easier to work with your members of your group, when they're collecting the information, they see it themselves. I don't get to see the information from my neighbours or the other 20 members of our catchment group, but they get to see their own, and it's just starting to understand what's going on in my place. But if we start sharing the information all of a sudden, and then someone starts interpreting it without having the full context and the full story there's no quicker way to turn off getting the goodwill of people doing water testing than actually sharing some information, coming up to a conclusion, which now trying to combat and saying, well, actually, I thought the full story wasn't being portrayed. So we're just going to make sure that we're getting a good data set, and then we can interpret it correctly and accurately. That's going to help us go to where there's a problem or not a problem.
That's good. Well, in closing, Ange, I think you should be congratulated for a superb job. To think
Absolutely.
this started in 2021. You've now got 10 groups, all engaged, all testing, water, soil, nitrates, all the things that are concerning to everyone. Pest control. The engagement that's been able to happen through your efforts with the catchment group, and just drive them up, and I think you probably won't accept it as real credit to you for doing that. And I think it proves that the zone committee did make that good decision all those years ago to turn that money into that big grant and to get everyone involved, which is what it's all about. So thank you for that. And so I'd just like to move that we accept Angela's report. Do I have a seconder for that? Artie, all those in favour? Aye. Okay, thanks, Ange.
Thanks, Bill. And also just acknowledging Duncan Barr's role as chair in the committee and all of that as well, because he's just come back from 2 months holiday, and none of us can do this on our own, so it's 100% a team effort.
Right, David, what's next?
Next we have Adrian Meredith. He's going to talk to us about the Ashburton River Hakatiri Hapua. Welcome, Adrian.
It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you this afternoon. Now, I understand you've had a number of questions about work recently on the Ashburton Hakatiri Hapua and its state, and certainly in particular on statements about it degrading or deteriorating, and I'll hopefully touch on some of those issues today in illustrating some of the work we've done over the last 3 or 4 years, or particularly the work that my colleague Jared Arthur has mostly driven, but many of us as a team have contributed as well. So starting here today, there's just an aerial photograph of the Ashburton Hapua from one of Jared's reports, and I'll start with that, just illustrating the nature of these coastal river mouths. They're interesting beasts. We've worked on them for a long time, but more particularly for the last 4 or 5 years. Rather than just a river mouth moving out into the sea, they tend to have a lot of standing water there. In this picture, the river mouth was pretty much running straight out to sea in the very centre of the where the river hits the coast, and has a very small sort of lake type environment where it goes out to the coast. But on the left of that photo, where you can see a bunch of sort of red and green sampling spots, there's quite a sort of water ponded area there down to the left. But equally, there's quite a bit of areas more to the right and further to the north, adjacent to the huts, where there's big areas of standing water that are quite important parts of the river. The 2 X's on the very right of the screen, a white X and the orange X mark, is pretty much where the river mouth was exiting to the sea during a lot of the work that my colleagues Jared and Duncan Gray were carrying out. So it just shows how dynamic these hapua or river mouths are, as the river can exit in all sorts of different spots and have a lot of different standing water. This makes them somewhat complicated. So really, in answer today, what I'll really cover is some multiple lines of evidence in responding to the questions on the state of Canterbury Hapua, and particularly since 2020. As I say, most of this work's led by Jared Arthur, who's an ECAN scientist, but he can't be here to talk to you today because he now works for Patel Delamore Partners and left the employment of the council back at the beginning of the year. What I'll cover today is sort of some Hapua surveys of fish populations, and we largely got that written up as a NIWA report to give it some independence. There's reporting of observations of fish, bird and physical habitat condition of the Hapua. That's largely Jared's ECAN report that I've taken that aerial photograph from that I've just shown you. And we also ensured there were some structured surveys of long-term users or residents of Hapua. And by that I mean the Rakaia, the Ashburton and the Rangitata Hapua, which are three South Canterbury or Mid Canterbury Hapua that are very similar. And the reason we carried that work out was there's a lot of residents or owners of those batches that have been at those river mouths for 50 or more years and have a long-standing belief or understanding of the system. So it was important to capture those ideas in a structured way while they were still here. And we had that work carried out once again by some NIWA scientists, it's in a structured sense, interviewing them and writing them up to bring a little bit of independence to that process as well. Finally, I'll also talk today about some assessments of catchment water quality state and trends in the Ashburton River and the Hapua, and really those we're drawing from the consent hearing for Ashburton Lyndhurst irrigation that subsequently got drawn off into the High Court process with ELS and the Ashburton Lyndhurst process and the consenting decision. And I suspect it's item 4 that you're probably looking for to some extent for some further evidence of degradation or deterioration statements that are going out there. But it's really important that we're working off multiple lines of evidence, so it's a series of different sort of ways of tackling this issue of what is the state of Hapua. So these are the 3 reports, the perceptions of change, and you've had these circulated to you for past meetings. I'll touch on them briefly, but once again, there's the 2 NIWA reports, and the centre one is fish community surveys of Canterbury Hapua that, once again, led by Jared Arthur. The ECAN report had a number of key messages in them, but I'll just draw your attention to 1 or 2 in that on the sort of fourth bullet point highlighted there, it says, in particular, the Hakatiri Ashburton Hapua had a very low overall abundance of fish in February 2021, which is when a lot of surveys were carried out, which coincided with low river flows and fish passage into the river mouth. So really what we're sort of pointing out there is that this is raising some significant issues, that flow of the Ashburton Hakatiri River is really important for maintaining that Hapua or river mouth sort of waterway complex, because when the flows get too low, the habitat becomes of quite poor quality and fish struggle to get in and out of that river mouth and it becomes quite poor. This is really reiterating the issue that we were dealing with the Ashburton River Plan Review, that really the Ashburton River needs more flow down at the bottom end, not only to keep the mouth open, but also to keep the Hapua healthy. The second bit I've highlighted down there is the 5th bullet point of the key messages of that report were that in 2021 surveys indicated a potential decrease in the populations of several fish species, and in particular black flounder, long-finned eel, Chinook salmon and brown trout, and particularly the smelt. Some might know them as cucumber fish or silveries. And really that loss of many of those different fish species is causing quite a bit of concern to a lot of people. Jared couched this in many ways by saying increased sample replication is required to better compare the results of historic surveys, because we're really struggling with a survey back in 1983 and then comparing that sort of 30 or more years later in 2021. It's really important to carry that out, but it's really hard to be absolutely certain on what the conclusions can be. If you look at the NIWA report of the perceptions of change, once again, the main points can be taken very readily from the executive summary of that report, and that the main issues identified for all three hapua were insufficient flows and deteriorating water quality, followed by increased fine sediment and periphyte, and that's algal growth on the bed, and more frequent migration of river mouths to the north. In other words, it was a reoccurring independent view we were hearing from a large number of these long-term residents of all three hapua, that there was very similar issues were being seen. And the main fishery issues that were identified for all three hapua were reduced abundance of smelt, which is once again the cucumber fish or silveries that are the food source for many of the other fish, the sea-run brown trout and Chinook salmon. And there was general agreement that the decline of Stokel smelt, which is a keystone species, was reasonably recent, especially in the past maybe 5 years or maybe 5 to 10 years. And the high feeding dependence of sea-run brown trout on smelt is thought to have resulted in a parallel decline of trout abundance, although that decline may have been over a longer period. A final point I'll take from this executive summary is that anglers often discussed the emotional impacts of the loss of the hapua fisheries that it had on their lives, and how the fishing huts at the hapua of all three rivers are now primarily used for community activities rather than the fishing effort that they'd been pretty much put to for the previous many decades. Just a few photos here, once again from Jared's report of the middle report. This is a photograph of the Ashburton River mouth at one of those X marks I pointed out on that earlier aerial photograph, showing that the river had moved a long way north to way past the huts to close to the cliffs, and was really just a trickle of water, a fairly small trickle of water running down the gravel to the sea. And this was in February 2021. Fish passage was very poor, owing to these prolonged low flows and a shallow, steep mouth running over the beach. And this is the sort of condition that really, to maintain healthy hapua and healthy rivers, we need to try to avoid this, generally by higher river flows. A few other photos from those reports are quite notable. The top left photo is the large multidisciplinary team of staff from Department of Conservation and Fish and Game, ECAN, and some from the Runanga, basically all beavering together to do a lot of this fish survey. But that top left photograph really shows how muddy these hapua environments can become. In other words, they're accumulating a lot of fine silt and mud and becoming quite muddy environments that are not good habitat for fish. The fish often struggle to spawn and complete their life cycles in these sort of environments. You know, up against the barrier beach out to the sea, you're still getting good clean gravel, but a lot of the hapua area are becoming quite muddy. And even the middle photograph down on the bottom middle is showing that where staff were electric fishing trying to catch fish, they were stirring up quite a mud plume behind them as they were walking through. Those are some of the sort of, and even the top right photograph, when the water bodies in the hapua are quite shallow, they were distinctly very sort of muddy and silty. In other words, the river is not really managing to clean itself out and accumulating a lot of that fine mud and silt in the river. Very much a flow issue, we believe. No, that's fine. Yes.
Oh, sorry, thank you. If I remember rightly, so May 2021 was when we had the big flood. Prior to that was a very dry, prolonged dry spell. I can remember what that looked like in our catchment. So as we look at these, I can see where you're coming from. But in context, the period that this monitoring went on, in context of that dry spell, if you took that out across, so will there be monitoring that happens beyond that, or is that a one-off? Because I think if it's one-off and it's particularly dry spell, I'd like some context on that as we go through, if we could please.
The surveys were carried out both in 2020 and 2021 over 2 different years. But and context is very important. And generally this sort of work is easier to carry out during stable flow periods. But it's also generally carried out in the sort of period of December, January, February, or just before that, which is when the fish are migrating into the river. Certainly the smelt are migrating into the river over that Christmas and early summer and early to midsummer period. So that's when we normally carry out the work, which is at low flow periods. Often those high flow floods, and I think you were mentioning May 2021, is often the late autumn, early winter is when the rivers get cleaned out by bigger freshers. But it's also trying to maintain their health during that summer or certainly the spring and summer period when the fish are carrying out a lot of their migration into the river, and when they're carrying out their breeding activities. But good point though.
Yeah, perhaps I wasn't clear. Not so much the time of year, but more that particular season. So if we did, I know we're talking about green streak particularly low and climate change and everything. If we look at that period on a graph of high rainfall, low rainfall, not the time of year, but in context of averaged it out, would that be representative of flows in the river across a longer period of time? Does that make more sense?
Once again, a very good question in context that with any science we try to put there. I don't have a good straight answer for you at the moment, that's why we try to extend the surveying to more than just 1 year or one period, so we've done it twice. If we'd done it again this year in 2024, we would have got another very dry year as well. I'm not sure how to answer the question for you at this stage, because we are very resource limited and we can't keep going back to these rivers all the time. There are a lot of issues to deal with right across Canterbury. But one of the conclusions I'll make at the end of this presentation is we are keeping an eye on these harpearl. We will be going back regularly, and we will be providing a bit of extra context, but we can't monitor them to this detail, to this extent all of the time. But I think given the 2 years we've done there, certainly one of them may have been a drier year, the other will be probably a little bit more average at the time, but we'll certainly come back to you on that.
I just have to say, Adrian, that this year, 2024, will be a completely different pitch to that, because you just said it was a dry year, but the mouth is flowing very strongly. Probably the biggest whitebait catches they've had.
Yep.
It wasn't small and grey, it was strong and blue. So to Andrew's point, to have credibility in these, you need to do a follow through if it's going to be November. Because, I mean, in February, where you do a lot of these figures from, there's obviously height of summer and the river will be reasonably low regardless of what's going on. So for integrity of data, it needs to be followed through.
No.
But I think you obviously understand that.
No, thank you. And it's good to discuss and clarify these things. But once again, probably the main point I'm making is that a lot of these activities that the fish are really reliant on are late summer, late spring, early summer, where often the low flow periods are most at risk. And, that's when the river needs water the most. But, yeah. I'll then move on to...
Bill, could I ask a question?
Oh, sorry.
Yep. Just with the report, I read, all the input and a lot of the wording that was put by people in it. And how did you combat the bias that a lot of the people that contributed have? Because, they are when you looked at the group of people in it, they're hard-nosed fishermen who are very anti other users of the river and other things. So, so I read, some talking about a good old fisherman says that I used to catch a lot more and they were bigger. That's the first comment that they have always. So how did you combat that? Because I read about the salmon, some of the reasons why they've declined over time and that sort of stuff. There's sort of facts in there, but if you read the report, you get this feeling that it's all bad, and it's caused by, I think they've mentioned quite a few times, dairy and farm conversions, and all irrigation was blamed. When we read some of the irrigation water enhanced it in the past, and there's other reasons. So I just a bit concerned that this report read very one way. It wasn't very, there's no mention of, the flows in the river. There's things that the flows have dropped, but there should be graphs of the flows, actual, because you must have those records for the last 50 years. RDR's flows, what it's got, all that real pure science should be laid against the anecdote that the river's dropped. Well, we need to see science. Yes, it has dropped, or it hasn't. To balance it out. So I'm just trying to understand how I can balance these two reports out.
No, they're good points. Then that's why there's a series of reports there. The surveying the long-standing residents or users of the river mouths was very much a social science exercise. While the people were still there and it was still available to do. Now, rather than it being just a sort of them having a rant, etc., there was a very social science structured interview process where they were standard questions that were put to them all that had been carefully designed beforehand, and then analysing the results of those. It's not just purely people being able to just sort of rant for hours on end or things like that. It was quite a structured process in following quite structured social science methods. And yes, but then that's why that report put all of those answers in there so that people could see the whole essence of it. Although I would suggest that yes, it reads very negatively, but probably that corresponds with the science reports we've put out as well, which are showing that what they are saying is corresponding with very low runs of fish into those rivers, not only the sports fish they were after, the salmon and trout, but also the food fish those fish are relying on, which is the smelt and other things, other forage fish like that as well. We were looking at water quality to some extent, and we certainly are always looking at the flow regimes of the rivers as well. So these are being pulled together to some extent.
Just have to agree with Richard, because I think it is a niche group that were with certain views that we used in this. There's no people from four-wheel drive clubs, recreational walkers, farmers who live on the riverbanks, all those. There's none of those. Just very small. So I think you call it science, but I'm not sure whether it is so scientific. But anyway, I think that point should be noted. It's very cliquey, weak group, and if you had another group that was just four-wheel drivers, people would say there's no variation in the people that were interviewed for this.
We did aim for a much broader sector of long-standing residents of those huts from the three rivers. It really was that long-standing fishing was that fishermen were a strong theme of that group. Other than that, they are slowly disappearing and the things are changing down there. But we were just trying to capture that sort of that element of the social fabric that had been down there at that time.
I think the only danger is in suddenly a report like this ends up in the front page of the media, and it's saying this is what's happening at Ashburton Hapu, which is not a true indication of what is happening.
Oh.
Because it's such a small focus group on their personal opinions, and that's just my opinion of it anyway.
Thank you.
Adrian, can I just ask you?
Sure.
So if we're looking at water quality at State Highway 1, and as a community, there's the go-to place that we look for states and trends and whatever. You're looking more at the outcomes of what's living in the water. Is there a correlation as a community? I look at it as a community and say, yep, okay, there's a report that's been put together about the Hapua, but actually the Hapua is a continuation of the Ashburton River down to there. And if we see that the water quality, is it good, bad or ugly at the State Highway 1, in which case, is all the problems that we've got at the bottom end in the Hapua, or is it actually further up the catchment, or actually is it a perception thing that we look as a community and say, well, 30 years ago we used to have a wool scour, and we used to have, where those big circles were there used to be a sewage plant and whatever, and that used to all make its way into the Ashburton River. As a perception, you could ask me, and I would say, actually, the river's actually improved a hell of a lot over those years. Have we done the job completely? No. but we've come a long way. But I wasn't actually picking that sort of tone up, that we actually have made some big improvements. And by the way, we used to discharge massive amounts of water on the weekends, which used to give the river a flush out and put some salmon in it. So how do you bring that context into a report? Because it does end up as evidence in a process. And I look at this thing going, is it as bad as this report says? And I just want to understand it. That's why I've asked the question for you to help explain it. Sorry.
No, fair comment. Look, it is important that these are a whole sequence of subjects and a whole sequence of reports that be read in association with each other, rather than just taking them one individually from each other. And sort of where I'll finish this report at the end is, as I'll deal a little bit with water quality as well. And really what we're trying to do is explain what we're seeing often in rivers, but in this case the Hapua, which was the subject we're talking about today. It is looking at it from a perspective of water quality and the flow regime and any other features that are driving these ecological outcomes, because often ecological outcomes of the fish communities and the fish availability and things like that is the ultimate expression of effect of water quality, water quantity and habitat and everything else. Maybe if I finish the presentation, then we come back to answer that question when I've dealt with the other little bits on water quality as well. But otherwise I agree with you. At the end of the day, it is looking at all of these different attributes together to get an overall feeling for what's driving the system and where's it coming to. But I totally agree with you. Over the last few decades, some serious discharges have been removed from rivers, and particularly the Ashburton River as well. It's improved in one manner, but maybe it's degraded in other ways. So maybe water quality's got, many attributes of water quality have got better, but the flow regime may have become more constrained. And those are the sort of things we need to think about. So I'd previously sent those 3 reports to you as the zone committee that I've just talked about now, but I'll also touch on the consent hearing and the High Court evidence that once again was largely prepared by Jared Arthur and presented by Jared Arthur, and he can scientist now at PDP. So the consent hearing was the renewal of consents for Ashburton Lyndhurst irrigation for their whole sort of command area and their irrigation area, and reflecting on the consequence of that whole activity that was then subsequently appealed to the High Court and became the ELS High Court challenge of that process. So once again, I'll show you here, just to illustrate that Jared Arthur produced evidence or Section 42A report for that hearing, and once again it's dated 20th of January 2021, giving some time context to it. And I've just pulled a couple of clauses out of his evidence to that consent hearing. And one, clause 11, went on to say that the Hakatiri Hapua is currently in a vulnerable state with total nitrogen concentrations below the national policy statement, freshwater management national bottom line, and is very likely increased over the last 10 years. So this is where he was starting to bring in a water quality element to why we were seeing the Hapua in a vulnerable or degraded state from a fish perspective. He then went on in clause 16 to say, given the high level of nitrate in groundwater down gradient of the Ashburton Lyndhurst Irrigation Limited managed land, it is possible that spring-fed waterways are not meeting the NPSFM 2020 national bottom line for nitrate in rivers. That's 2.4 milligram per litre. Meanwhile, the Hapua is highly vulnerable to eutrophication, which is high algal material and a lot of growth of algae, etc. And the ecological health of the Hakatiri Ashburton River is showing signs of decline. The management of runoff contaminants stemming from agricultural land uses, e.g. sediment, phosphorus and E. coli, that are enabled through a nutrient discharge consent also remains important to improving stream, river and Hapua health. So these are the sort of statements in that hearing process that were being reflected on in terms of there being a water quality issue that went hand in hand with some of the ecological issues that people were seeing down at the Hapua.
Sorry, Adrian, I might have this wrong, but being below the NPSM, isn't that a good thing?
there's an issue here. Yeah, I struggle with that a little. By below, it meant it was worse than the bottom line, is what he was meaning by that.
Worse than the,
Yeah.
so it's above the,
Yeah.
the range.
It was above the range in a concentration sense, but below in terms of it being a
Yeah,
degradation.
because I just sort of meant
Yeah.
below the figure, which would be good.
And I'll go on to say there is that this is a table of total nitrogen from the NPSFM, and showing that the national bottom line is 750, or depending on which type of lake you deem it to be, it should be 750 or 800 milligram per cubic metre, which in probably terms you're probably more familiar with would be 0.75 or 0.8 milligram per litre if you reflect that into sort of nitrate conditions. Currently, the lower Ashburton River has median nitrate concentrations of about 1.02. It's sort of State Highway 1 and down by the mouth. And all of our evidence to date is showing that in the last 5 to 10 years, that is likely increasing and still increasing as a trend. And once again, I'll illustrate that by taking some screenshots that I took just this morning from the Lawa Land Air Water Aotearoa database. And this is the Ashburton River Hakatiri, just upstream of the mouth data, which is showing that total nitrogen is in the worst 25% of all sites, and the trends are showing it's likely degrading. And once again, the 5-year median is 1.05 milligram per litre. Similar with total oxidised nitrogen, dissolved inorganic nitrogen, which is the available nitrogen nutrients for algal growth, it's likely degrading as well. And then nitrate there as well. It's indeterminate, but essentially this is the public-facing water data we have out there. So, and both the Ashburton River at State Highway 1 and just upstream of the Hakatiri mouth are showing very similar results of a degrading trend, and concentrations increasing at about that 1 milligram per litre. And the 1 milligram per litre becomes important because we're looking at that Hapua as a lake-type environment, not a river-type environment, because when the water is there for a reasonable period of time, days to weeks, it's not having a toxic effect. It's actually having an algal growth effect of enabling periphyton to grow on the bed of the Hapua, or phytoplankton, which is algae suspended in the water column growing in the water down there, which are essentially greening the Hapua, making it a much more eutrophic greened environment that's not so good for the fish moving through it.
So Adrian, in the old days, not so long ago, you used to go down and take samples physically, didn't you? You used to do that. So now there's a machine recording live info all the time. Is that where those figures come from?
No, these are monthly grab. This is based off monthly grab samples of water
Just
quality.
grab samples monthly?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
The meter you've heard from the Mid Canterbury Collective users and other community groups have been using is a logger that's pretty much measuring nitrogen only. Those machines really can't measure total nitrogen or some of the other elements that you'd normally be wanting to consider in lake environments or in ponded environments when you're really starting to worry about algal growth in particular. I'll just finish this presentation with also, this is a report that Zella Smith and I were doing, and once again it's 20 years ago in June 2024, and Jared was, in his evidence, was talking about water quality in spring-fed streams of this mid-Canterbury area below the Ashburton Lyndhurst. Now, here I've just grabbed a couple of lumps of data from a report that we produced in about 2004, but wasn't ever fully completed. But it's showing the nitrate, nitrogen and riverside stream that comes down through Five Star Beef, was showing nitrate concentrations of 10 to 12 milligram per litre. And the next block of data that I've just pulled out from there, which is in red, which is Wakanui Creek, the nitrate nitrogen concentration is largely in that 6 to 8 milligram per litre range. Now, we've had a few grab samples in recent years, and you've discussed Wakanui Creek and the Wakanui Hapua down at the coast. fishing, with Forest and Bird and others in recent years. And we're still getting concentrations between 6, 8, 10 milligram per litre in Wakanui Creek there as well, which is illustrating that in these spring-fed streams, particularly as we come down near the coast, the nitrate concentrations are still high. They're not decreasing, if anything. In some of them, they are still slightly increasing. And this is all pieces of evidence that we're utilising as well to sort of try to build these stories. And so we're looking at spring-fed streams. We're looking at the groundwater data that was also in this hearing. We're looking at the Ashburton River, and we're looking at the Hapua, trying to build this story. So the conclusions from here is I think we really need to maintain scrutiny of the condition of the Hapua, and that was some of the questions I was getting earlier. We're not going to be relying entirely on what 2020 and 2021 were telling us. We need to keep a look at, but that's because it's an important habitat for the health of the river. If we really want that river to have healthy ecology, pretty much a lot of the fish have to move down through that Hapua to basically complete their life cycle, and we need to maintain that health. We need to continue the level of monitoring of the Ashburton Hakatiri River, so we're seeing that state and the trends that I've just shown you, so that we're staying up to speed with that. And we need to continue the level of monitoring Ashburton groundwater quality as well, because that's where most of the nutrients, particularly the nitrogen, are moving through and often are rising down near the coast in either the surface water or out in the ocean. Finally, we need to update our water quality knowledge of spring-fed waterways, in other words, Riverside Creek, Wakanui Creek, Mount Harding Creek, and others as well, because those are another expression of what's going on in the catchment. And I'd finally finish by saying much of this remains very relevant to the Ashburton River plan components, and particularly the rationale for the recent plan review that remains very controversial, remains debated at length and controversial for many. Maintaining and increasing flows in the Ashburton Hakatiri River to both keep the mouth open is still relevant, but it's also to maintain the health of the Hapua habitats and the ecology, and which is flushing out the silt, maintaining low algal growth down there, and improving water quality such that the fish and the ecology can maintain maintain their life cycle, complete their life cycle, and contribute meaningfully to the river as a whole. So I hope, and finally acknowledging that it will always be debated, but that there is deterioration and a degrading state of the system, which is what we're trying to make some headway into improving, which is what the Ashburton River Plan and Plan Review were aiming to address. I'll probably leave it at that point. Very controversial subject, but this is you asked for a highlight of what information we're using, and I hope that sort of helped you a little bit more of where some of these terms, degrading, deterioration, are coming from.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you coming, Adrian. Is there some questions? Have you
Yes.
got, yeah, Richard.
Yeah, could you just flick back to the slide before? One of our district's greatest criticisms of ECAN at the moment is that not one place on that does it mention work with local organisations who are investing in water quality monitoring, which is probably, there's massive amounts of monitoring going on. And we just heard the other day that ECAN voted, the councillors voted to spend money on randomly checking water samples in our district and around the districts. And I don't think they were aware, or some of the councillors maybe, many weren't aware of the huge amount of monitoring that's going on. So it's just, in your conclusion, I don't see anywhere work with locals. I don't see that anywhere there. I just see the we know best. It's not getting you at all. I'm just saying that the thought is all the good work that's being done in the catchment groups and the irrigation companies and all the monitoring that's going on, it's perhaps not being recognised in the conclusions from some of these reports. We went back to 2004 and quoted numbers, and everybody knows that those numbers are not that reliable because they're very, very small, sample sizes. Whereas now we're in an era of huge sample sizes, so we should be recognising that the science will only get better. So we should be concluding that we need to work with local organisations that are doing a lot of work. So I'm just, how do you bridge that gap that's actually, just last week it happened. The gap was exposed between ECAN and the rest of this district.
No, that's a very fair comment, and I acknowledge the point you make there, that sort of working with communities is a very important way of going forward, not just with those, as you pointed out, as many pointed out, those complaining about the river mouth, but monitoring as well. You know, and yes, I fully take on board your comment that monitoring is really important because it empowers people in all sorts of ways of it being evidence-based and logic-based and things like that. And so, yes, accept that as an omission here. I must say I was largely utilising information in front of me to answer the particular questions and to make the case, but no, totally accept that communities have a big role to play as well, to bring them along with us and to contribute community monitoring in this place.
Yeah, Adrian, you're highlighting the point that there's some ongoing science that's required. You said that you're spread very thin. The community probably understands that there's water testing done for swimming, for safe swimming, that's done for certain times of the year. Do we actually have a plan, or does ECAN have a plan that they can share with the community of what sites are being monitored for when? Because one of the biggest economic drivers in our community is the access to using the Ashburton River resource, the Hapua, whatever. But we don't seem to know what the plan is, and is it up to individuals to go and do all that science? But you guys, ECAN seems to be doing some science. But are we building a comprehensive enough story? Because the plan that we've got at the moment, and there it's saying maintaining increasing flows in the Ashburton and Hecatory River to both keep the river mouth open and maintain the health of Hapua, improving water quality. And that was the plan review. But we haven't got all the players on the Ashburton River on the same page. So yeah, what science can we do to get everyone on that page? And how can you feed that back to us as to what you're doing?
I'll throw up the lower slide because to some extent it's a similar question that gets asked throughout New Zealand, and national approaches like LAWA is a big one to both make it meaningful, make it forward-facing, allow the public to see a lot of, and this is the ECAN monitoring. LAWA is also very soon, I understand, going to be looking at ways of putting community monitoring on this sort of national website as well, to sort of broaden it out. There's also just been released very recently another series on the LAWA website of good news stories, success stories with communities of how benefits have been made. So I'm probably not describing it as well as I might, but I'm trying to say that LAWA is going to be a nationwide vehicle for both the good people of Canterbury and throughout New Zealand to sort of get the sort of information and the two-way exchange with communities in this way, because yes, we don't want it to be a surprise to people. We want information to be available to them. We want it to be transparent and open. And I think LAWA has been a really good way forward that we're pushing. We've been fundamentally pushing as well, and we're one of the leading councils in the country for making LAWA successful. But you make a good point. It's all about having information out there and making the public be aware of it, not just safe swimming sites, but all monitoring and what they can do to make a difference. And some good news success stories of where successes have been achieved in New Zealand with communities and waterways.
You'll probably to add to that, one of my biggest bugbears is we look at the water monitoring at the bottom of the system, but it doesn't take us to where the problem is. It's like measuring Lake Kemp out in the middle of the lake. It doesn't tell you what the problem is, just says that's what the lake water is. It doesn't say that this creek's doing this or this one's doing something else. And that's the same problem with when I look at the LAWA data there. It's telling us something right down the very bottom, but it's not actually telling us what we need to do if there's something we can go towards to try and find a solution, if there's a problem.
We were talking about the Hapua today, so I picked the site at the bottom end that was most relevant to what we've been talking about today. But as you can see on that map, there are eight other sites within the Ashburton catchment that I could equally have selected and then had this sort of data coming out. So whether it was up in the headwaters, up in Otawharakai, Ashburton Lakes, whether it was State Highway 72 on the north or south branch of the Ashburton, whether it was State Highway 1, you know, that's what we're working towards, so that people can look into different parts of the catchment and see the story, and then start to compare different sites as well.
These things are ganging up on me today. That one's working. Because Richards, they're queued. Richards is next.
Oh, sorry.
Red. You're green. So now you. Just move that one to there. All right, no, I'm good now. Thank you for your presentation. I'll pick up on it, while we were talking about the hapa and everything else. Towards the end, you mentioned spring-fed creeks. So to try and get an understanding, obviously, flows and certain waterways going dry, I tried to get an understanding and context of history of what that's looked like. So where we live in the lowlands drains, the drain that runs through our place. So when you go back through Papers Pass, so pre-RDR and irrigation, those drains went dry. That was the nature of them. And you can read articles where there was a poor yield and drains were dry. So with the change of irrigation methods, you know, from wild flooding and borders to more efficient use of water and how we irrigate now, and the stock water change and closures. So in context with quite a bit of modification, quite significant modification, how do we assess our drains now in that context? So we're doing better with better efficient use of water, which is great, but then there's unintended consequences. So it's the ripple effect of that change that we're bringing about. We're using stock water race more efficiently or cutting that down, but where the Parakanoi, our particular drain, had 7 stock water races at least that terminated into it, none of them exist now. They've all been closed down. I struggle to find that context brought into conversations about the state of some of our drains and our waterways. Are you in a position to comment on that?
I'm nervous about drawing too widely into the subject, but I hear what you're saying, having worked in mid-Canterbury a lot over the last 20, 25 years. And I think we do strive strongly to identify what these big changes have been. The two coastal streams I'm illustrating up here, sort of Riverside and Wakanui, are probably quite different to what you're describing, because there wasn't border dike irrigation in this area, and so often the differences we're seeing in this area are being driven by different land use changes. Often the differences in these streams are because of there hadn't been augmentation by border dike irrigation type systems, but in fact the big increase in irrigation here had been a massive increase in groundwater abstraction. When you head down to Parakanoi and the Hines area, you're very right that there's been a whole series of changes over multiple decades of no irrigation and then border dike irrigation and then efficient irrigation, and those certainly, yes, those need to be taken into consideration, but they make it very difficult to tease apart what a natural state would have been.
As long as that context hasn't been lost in the narrative, as long as that's being incorporated in, because
Very much so.
I'll finish with the Papers passed on the 12th of December 1913, where the Hines Bridge was being opened, and in the quote from the gentleman opening it was, "This bridge has been built under false pretences," because there was no water and hadn't been for quite some time. I contrast that with standing under the Poplar Bridge with a senior member of DOC talking about Hines once being a world-renowned fishery. I think Chris has hit the nail on the head. On the weekend, a fair bit of water used to come down out of the Mayfield Hines scheme, or it was RDR water. So again, can we please make sure when we're having these discussions that we're doing it fully and frankly, because that river was predominantly dry. It was the last place to be bridged on State Highway 1 for all the obvious reasons, and still people thought it was a waste of money to bridge it. And we know that it wasn't a river, I think Boundary Road or Surveyors Road down, and so that was man-made dug. So when we're talking about our waterways, we need to make sure that we're not just picking and choosing narratives that suit our lens or our filter. So can't emphasise that point enough.
In many respects, I totally agree with you, is that careful consideration of context is really important. Canterbury is a big area of, a massive area of plains with a massive groundwater aquifer, and the conditions can change very much year to year. It's very difficult saying what they would predominantly have been, because many of these rivers may have been dry some years and then flowed strongly other years. And certainly closer to Christchurch, the Selwyn River is another one that the good people of Christchurch are very aware of, and it has many different features and feelings, and I totally acknowledge the Hinds as well. But once again, they have different reaches as well. The lower end of the Hinds is very much a gaining. It had previously been a wetland, so it had been very much a gaining reach. And many of these rivers across the plains have losing and gaining reaches. Context is incredibly important, and unfortunately, some of these conversations from both sides are very unsatisfactory because people argue them in all sorts of ways. But wearing a science hat myself, I think things have to be very objective, and I'd like to see a lot more careful consideration. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, thanks for alerting us to the Lawa side, is it? LAWA side. I'm just having a look through then. There's some good stories there too, like the Ashburton Bridge, E. coli's gone down, nitrates, the trend's a certain direction, but if you look into the data, some of the data is so low that I think the nitrate at the Ashburton Bridge, ammonical, is it CSA, nitrogen, the trend is likely degrading, but it's at 0.0005, and if you look at the graph, it doesn't go any lower, so it's a bit like the graph is so low that you can't actually measure it almost, so I think people should have a look at that and they'll make their own conclusions. So I want people need to do that, not just look at that trend. That's probably the worst possible one you could see, but I think if you look at some of the trends, if you looked at a graph, it's very hard to see if there's a trend, and so I think we just need to look it up ourselves and have a look and make those conclusions.
Oh, without doubt, and there's a wide suite of parameters measured uniformly across the country, and therefore it's making sure you analyse appropriate parameters that are appropriate to the situation. Ammonia is a very awkward one. It is very toxic, but often not present or at very low concentrations, and it's often not a parameter that's really worth considering to some extent, unless it becomes high. Once again, that's the challenge of making science available to the public, and is trying to make it as meaningful, or making sure as much of the context is available as possible.
Okay, well, Adrian, I'd like to thank you for coming and presenting to us, fronting up. You've got a lot of experience and seen you a lot in the district to do that. And I think that probably the three things that the committee would like you to think about when you go away is that with ECAN is to work with the local community groups. We do feel that we're missing out a bit, and as Angela pointed out, where these groups are doing testing, which might working with your testing and everything, just a bit more communication with the community groups, because we don't want a them and us situation, because we are really all together in this, and I know you're the regulator, but we're the ones being regulated, so we can communicate. It'd be good. And it'd be nice to share a few good news stories, so I'm glad Richard said there were a few on that site. And I don't think ECAN needs to be too aggressive, because I don't think it's helpful having one of the worst 25% site, on that graph you had there, one of the 25% worst site or something. I don't know what that is measured against. I don't know what that achieves. Let's try and keep positive. If it's deteriorating, we've got to do something about it. But, just a little more user-friendly would be appreciated. But thank you once again. So I'll move we accept Adrian's report. I have a second for that. Yep, Angela, all those in favour? Aye. Thank you very much. So Dave, what's next?
So next it's the committee report, courtesy of Jamie and me.
Jamie gone.
Jamie's had to go now. She's off to her Banks Peninsula meeting. So the first item is the CWMS Zone Committee review. So there's an update on there on where we've got to. In a nutshell, the the first phase of development and listening and advice is finished, and are about to go to the Mayoral Forum on Friday for their decision and direction, which is likely to include a decision on whether or not the Mayoral Forum continues to support the zoning committee structure, and if not, what alternative models will be further explored, for 4 decisions in the first half of 2025.
Can I just butt in there? Because Chris, did you sit in on the discussion last month when I couldn't make it? Is that right? Yeah,
Yes,
no,
he
no,
did.
Have you got something to? Did you?
Yes, I did sit on it, Bill. Thank you, and thank you. I'd rather you sat on it. Yeah, it was more of a bringing us up to date with just a broad discussion. Actually, I can't recall all the details around it at the time. It seemed quite logical what they were doing, but it was. I can't remember this. Yeah, it's a whole. I did get an email follow up from that actually.
I can jump in and probably,
Yeah.
because Chris actually gave us quite a bit of quite a few recommendations on the day.
You can't remember them.
Yeah, we can discard them now. There was a lot of talk about the CWMS and its relevance, and getting back to basics, I think, in terms of focusing on those targets that we have in there, which I thought was really good feedback. There was a lot of good feedback from the zone chairs and deputies, which will be taken into account. Yeah.
Did you go on the daily?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think Murray sent a link out. There must be an update soon.
Yeah. Yes, Murray did send a,
Yesterday. I haven't.
yes,
I've just noticed it.
yeah, he sent, I think, a summary of what was said in that meeting.
It came back through yet.
Yeah, but he's also sent a note that he's going to
Yes.
talk to us.
Yes, so there's going to be, he's looking at the 11th of December for a update on what the Mayoral Forum has decided, so
Yeah.
that will be feeding back to the chairs and deputies again.
Yeah.
So that's where it's at. That's it.
Just a question on that. As a joint committee, the district council must have some, have some feedback in that as well, because this is just effectively the ECAN side of the equation, isn't it? Am I correct there, or how's that relationship working?
Yeah, there will be feedback to the district councils, and I think there's talk of that in here somewhere. I saw it. Yes, it is.
Will there be a Mayoral Forum?
Yes, following the Mayoral Forum, there will be feedback, because there's a lot of discussion has to happen with district councils, for sure. There's and the Runanga as well. Yep. Then there's a list of issues there, or things, what should you call it, key dates and milestones. So that's just, again, summarising what I've said. Table 1, this is just part of the Zone Committee review. And then number 2, representational review. You're probably all across that. That's
Nothing's changed.
nothing much has changed. I think there's some minor changes. I believe Ashburton District Council's had a submission on some parts of that representational review.
Talk to that if you like.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so we effectively appealed it, because obviously if someone else appeals it, because you could say it's gone our way effectively, and our representation is what it was, which was a better outcome than what was proposed. So if we hadn't appealed it, we would not be in the room if someone appealed the other direction. So we've appealed for that reason effectively, if you understand what I mean, to be part of the conversation.
Cool. So that actually closed yesterday. So now it will go. I think it goes back to council, then it goes to the local government commission, and they will come back. It was final determination. Looks like by April 2025. So quite a process. The next one is just the Methvins Lion Club. Remember the Garden of Harmony? They wanted to amend it, then they didn't need to amend it, and now, because they're having to do this planting plan, it's just putting them back a bit. So they now need to, we need to do a variation of the contract just to push the date back a bit for them doing the planting, and that will just be done between ECAN and them. So it should just happen, I would think. The committee asked for some information on the Rakatata revival, an update on that. I've got this update here, which is just saying that they I'm just catching up again. they're pointing towards a newsletter. There's going to be some presentation, and then they're happy to come back probably in the new year. So there's something we can look at next year. And then actions from the previous meeting. So that's Adrian's presentation, the first one. And then, so the Rakatada one we've just covered. And then...
Question on that one?
Yep.
Could we perhaps approach the district council, because we have a representative on the steering committee?
Yep.
And they could perhaps report to us on what they're thinking. That would be a good way of us getting a bit closer to the heat as it was, rather than just getting the newsletter after the fact.
Yeah, could do. Yeah. See what they say. Yeah. So you're just looking at that again. It's going to be reviewed by a steering group. Draft will be updated and put to the community for consultation. And the timeline's not confirmed yet. So it would be quite appropriate, I think, to committee to have a bit of a look at that. Yeah. Request for information on the dry summer plan. So there's an email went out about the, you would have got an email about the
a couple of days ago.
yeah, about the policy, the report that went to the ECAN Regional Delivery Committee. I've been updated that the workshop is planned for early 2025 with ECAN councillors. So I guess after that we'll have a bit more direction on what that is. So it's quite a region-wide big kind of thing, rather than I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're wanting, or whether you wanted something just a bit more local.
But I presume everyone got that in their email just
Yeah.
a couple of days ago. Yeah.
And then
Can I just make a comment? My only concern with that was it talked about low rainfall periods and climate change.
Yep.
It didn't talk about plan changes
right, yeah,
and how that can affect it. Because if I'm a freshwater clay living in Carter's Creek,
Yep.
there's been low rainfall periods before. It hasn't put my whole community at jeopardy. There's been, climate changes, climate for however long hasn't put that, aquatic life at jeopardy. But a plan change has, been what's resulted in that coming about. So yes, high dry seasons and everything else, but also decisions that we make have an impact on the aquatic life. So I think recognition of that would be helpful, beyond my only feedback reading it.
yep. And I guess that will come through the plan change process as well. Community feedback through the RPS as well. But yep, good point. And then Chris, you asked the question around a plan change or a plan review on the Ashburton River. There doesn't seem to be any specific Ashburton River one, but there's the whole regional plan change, the integrated plan, which is due for notification 2028. So we're working towards that, but as you know, there's a whole lot of things going on in terms of national direction on that at the moment. So
Just on that, is the land and water plan up for its 10-year review then, or is this ECAN doing a new plan that they're waiting for central government direction that they're allowed to do? Because I wasn't too sure when Ian mentioned that there's going to be a review of the Ashburton plan. Well, the Ashburton plan was done at the same time as the land and water plan. It was in the first lot of hearings that they did. So it was just getting clarification as to what process is going on, so that the community can understand that there is going to be a review, or is this an overhaul and completely new ball game?
I'm no planner, but my understanding is the land and water plan, well, it won't be just the land and water plan, it will be more integrated, the whole plan for the region. So I don't think there's any specific Ashburton one. So this is kind of, yeah, I really need a planner here, but we're doing the RPS, which would lead into the new integrated plan. So that will include I believe, like coastal and all the other areas as well. But I can get back to you with some proper planning speak on that. Yeah.
Plan was being reviewed in 2027, but
That was what Ian alluded to.
but that's not the case. Well, you just
Yeah.
did you ask that question? Or you and they came back with 28.
I asked one of my key planning people, and she said, no, there's no,
Okay.
it's just the
That's
overall plan. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks, Ange. The overall plan, and it's 2028 for notification, so a lot of work to do before then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
And the next thing is just the zone committee calendar, which has got some indicative dates for next year. Of course, we don't know what the zone committee's going to look like next year. But the question, I guess, is the first meeting's 28th of January. We've traditionally gone for late January because otherwise we're waiting until the end of February before we're getting into gear. Comment there that I've had is that probably there's not going to be a lot of council staff around during January for preparation of papers and things. And we're probably still figuring out what we're going to do. So do we want to do a field trip or some sort of community-facing thing in late January, or do you want to defer till February? It's kind of the question.
It's going to have a look at It's going to have a look at Lake Kemp and see what that's doing. Let's go and talk to Green Street people on the way up or something. And
Yeah,
these things were.
not have a meeting in here in January. It'd be better to be out and about somewhere.
Yep, so a field trip. Yep. Any other ideas? Sort of go up through the catchment. Scones at
It was
your
quite
place?
topical last year, so let's go and see how things are shaping up this year.
Yeah.
Before we
We
find
could
out
look at
whether
the
we've got a job or
Rangitata.
not.
Come back down to the Rangitata, couldn't we?
Mm-hmm.
But as you say, it's an interesting time of the year with people on holiday and things and busy. And
Well,
depends on a field trip. And
Yep.
What do we do? Or do we just do it in February and just not have a meeting?
yeah,
February?
yeah.
February.
What are your feelings? January, February? February. Right. February, yeah.
Well, how about we say nothing in January,
And plan for February
and
field trip.
we'll plan for February for a field trip unless, knowing what we know by then about zone committee structure or
Yeah.
whatever, we may have other things we need to do.
That sounds good, David. Yeah.
Cool, okay.
Thanks for your leadership on that, Chris.
Assuming we are still here and we do have a budget to fund next year, if we start receiving application, it could be an idea to see some of the projects that are asking for funding
Oh, that's
before we discuss that.
Yeah.
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 That would be a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be another trip at a different time, but that's not a bad idea.
We could look at all the work that Doc are doing up the Hedgewood Lake.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the end of the report.
If Chris doesn't hold us up, we're going to be finished by 3.
Yeah.
Is there any general business anyone like to bring up? Nothing there. Okay, well, if you could close the meeting, Dave, please.
Unihia ki te uru tapanui o tāne. Kia wātia, kia māma, te nako, te tinana, te waiurua, I te ara tākatū. Koe rā e rongo whakaaria aki ki wonga. Kia tina, tina, haumie, huie, tai ki e.